They told you the past was dust. A silent echo. But some legacies don't fade. They rot beneath the floorboards, whispering. You were never supposed to hear this. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was true. In 1862, the creaking floorboards of a forgotten church in upstate New York split open to reveal a graveyard. Not marked, not mourned, hidden. 143 skeletons, each one bearing the signature of prolonged torment. Fractured limbs, healed. Which means the pain was methodical, repeated. Not chaos, but ritual. Imagine that. Pain, systemized like a liturgy. Drowning, then revival. Starvation, then scripture. And always, the carvings, not symbols, but inscriptions etched into bone. These weren't victims. They were offerings. The church above them was called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Sounds divine, doesn't it? But that name was a shroud, stitched by three brothers who didn't come to save. They came to cleanse. And cleansing, to them, meant purification by agony. Ezra, Silas, and Caleb Ravencroft. Their eyes didn't flicker with belief, they burned with control. Control over minds, over pain, over truth. They spoke of salvation but delivered submission. And their followers, men, women, children, walked willingly into the fire, convinced their suffering had meaning. Do you understand what that means? They turned pain into a sacrament. They made torture a holy act. And the world above slept peacefully, comforted by sermons and hymns, never knowing that beneath their feet, divinity was rewritten in blood. This story isn't about a cult. It's about the architecture of control. How belief becomes bondage. How leaders become deities. And how silence, your silence, becomes complicity. This isn't just forgotten history. This is forbidden knowledge. Buried by federal seals. Sealed away in archives only the clear can touch. But someone opened the vault. Someone looked too long at the scars left in stone and bone. And now, it's too late to look away. The deeper you go into this, the more the story changes you. Your mind doesn't come back from this intact. And maybe, that's the point. You are not just hearing this. You are being initiated. You are standing at the threshold of revelation. The door has creaked open. Now step through it. They didn't arrive like devils. That's the part no one tells you. Evil rarely shows its teeth. It smiles. It prays. It blends. The Ravencroft brothers came to Ravenwood in the summer of 1825. A remote village nestled in the thick woods of upstate New York, 300 souls trying to survive on farming and trade. Nothing remarkable. Nothing threatening. And that's what made it perfect. Ezra was the oldest, tall, severe, with eyes like black mirrors. Silas wrote in leather-bound books that never left his side. And Caleb. Caleb was the shadow you didn't notice until it whispered in your ear. Charisma isn't loud. It's invasive. They bought land just outside of town. Not land for crops, not land for cattle. Land to build something sacred. A church. But this was no simple chapel. Black stone, quarried from deep in the hills. Octagonal design, a shape used in occult architecture for centuries, often as containment. No windows. Just cold walls and controlled light. They weren't building a house of worship. They were building a vessel. When they opened their doors, the people came. Curious, bored, grieving. Most had buried someone they loved. Some had buried themselves. And the brothers knew, pain is the easiest key to devotion. Offer someone meaning in their suffering, and you can own them. Ezra declared they had been called. Not by a God you'd recognize, but by a force older than Scripture. A spirit that required purification, of flesh, of mind, of lineage. And in that dimly lit sanctuary, surrounded by flickering lanterns and silent eyes, the people listened. They didn't scream. They didn't run. Because it didn't start with blood. It started with poetry. sermons that made sense to the broken. You're not suffering for nothing, they were told. You're being prepared. You're chosen. And that word, chosen, is how it always begins. You think cults start with sacrifice? No. They start with belonging. The Ravencrofts didn't demand loyalty overnight. They seduced it. Fasting. Prayer. Cold water on bare skin to simulate rebirth. Just enough discomfort to feel divine, never enough to raise alarm. Conditioning. Like training the soul to obey. It wasn't religion. It was engineering. By the end of that first year, the Church of the Pure Spirit had swallowed nearly 100 lives. Not violently. Not yet. But fully. And no one, not the mayor, not the law, not the parents tucking in their children, saw what was coming. Because how could you fear what looked like salvation? By the time the first chamber was carved into the stone beneath the church, the surface world had already forgotten how to question. It began in 1829, on the longest night of the year. Winter solstice. In the black heart of December, something shifted, permanently. Elder Ezra announced a revelation had come to Prophet Caleb during one of his visions. The congregation was summoned at sundown. What they walked into wasn't a service. It was an initiation into a truth they didn't yet recognize as a prison. Inside the sanctuary, all the lanterns were extinguished. Only 12 massive candles burned, each placed at the point of a spiral carved into the wooden floor, winding inward to a raised platform at the center. Silence. And then a voice. Ezra, booming and euphoric, we have been gentle shepherds. But the Spirit now demands courage. True cleansing. You will ascend, if you survive. Then Caleb appeared, moving like a marionette, pale and convulsing, muttering in a tongue no one could recognize. Guttural. Ancient. He collapsed mid-sentence, only to rise again, slowly, smiling like he'd swallowed God. He spoke 3 names, Sarah Pembroke. Michael Collins. Rebecca Winters. You have been chosen, he said. Tonight you ascend. They didn't resist. They wept. This is what indoctrination does. It replaces the fear of pain with the fear of rejection. They weren't afraid to die. They were afraid to disappoint. The rituals that followed were nothing short of ceremonial torture. Bound to inverted wooden crosses, symbolic, Ezra explained, of the reversal of pride into humility, the 3 were subjected to what he called the 7 trials of purification. Trial of air, waterboarding, slow and deliberate. Trial of earth, buried in church soil, neck deep. Trial of fire, hot metal, carefully applied, just enough to scar, not enough to kill. Trial of water, submersion in ice, revival, submersion again. And the last 3? Only fragments remain in witness accounts. Vomiting. Fainting. The air thick with chemicals and prayers. And when it was over, when the 3 hung limp but alive, Caleb whispered something into each of their ears. Their bodies convulsed. Spines cracked. Blood vessels burst behind their eyes. And then, they spoke, in the same inhuman tongue Caleb had used. Within minutes, all 3 were dead. Ezra raised his hands and declared it holy. The first ascension. And the rest of the congregation? They applauded. They worshipped. You're wondering how. You're asking, how can a sane person watch that and not scream? Because sanity had already been traded, for purpose. The bodies were not buried. They were not mourned, either. They were preserved, laid carefully in stone alcoves beneath the church, dressed in white, their faces scrubbed and repositioned into expressions of ecstasy. Worshippers were invited to kneel beside them, to touch their cold hands, to pray for the strength to be worthy of the same elevation. Death, you see, was no longer the end. It had been rebranded. It was a promotion. This is the genius of control, redefinition. Change what a word means, and you change how a man thinks. In the Church of the Pure Spirit, agony became grace. Pain became cleansing. And death? Death became a doorway you were lucky to walk through. By 1830, the Ravencroft brothers had turned transformation into a system. The ceremonies became more elaborate. The underground chambers more sophisticated. What began as one candlelit room expanded into 7 specialized catacombs, each with a name etched in Latin over its archway: the Chamber of Trials, the Chamber of Preparation, the Chamber of Ascension, and most grotesque of all, the Chamber of Saints. This is where they kept them. Not just the first 3, but all who followed. By 1835, there were dozens. Not dumped. Displayed. Some mummified. Some posed in prayer. Some wired like puppets, joints locked into positions that implied holy ecstasy. Overhead, hymns were sung. Below, corpses became relics. Former member Elizabeth Carver would later confess, "I wept the first time I saw them. I thought I was weeping with awe. I realize now, it was horror." This wasn't madness. It was strategy. Step by step, the brothers escalated the rituals. A slow boil. Each stage seemed only slightly more extreme than the last. No single event was enough to cause rebellion. And each act of cruelty was wrapped in ceremony, in scripture, in holy language that softened its brutality. The congregation believed they were ascending. They didn't know they were disappearing. And here's the truth most will never admit. They weren't kidnapped. They weren't dragged. They walked into the catacombs. Smiling. Because when belief has been weaponized, when doctrine is forged in pain, when suffering becomes the currency of salvation, you don't need chains to keep a man captive. You just need meaning. By 1835, the Ravencroft brothers had crossed the line between cult and machine. What began as prophecy had become production. Elevations, their term for ritual murder, were scheduled like mass. Once quarterly. Then monthly. By 1840, there were special holy seasons during solstices and equinoxes, where up to a dozen souls would be offered in a single night. Each death followed a script. Each scream echoed within sacred geometry. Each corpse was a monument to obedience. But death wasn't the only currency anymore. It was just the most visible one. Behind closed doors, another system emerged, one far colder than theology. Commerce. The brothers had found a market for the flesh they no longer wished to preserve. Medical colleges across the Northeast were starving for cadavers. Legal supplies were limited to executed criminals, and those were rare. But inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, there was no shortage of bodies. Deacon Silas, ever the scholar, made contact with men who didn't ask questions. In Albany. In Philadelphia. Even in Boston. Records would later show donations listed in vague notations, anatomical contributions, spiritual offerings, vessels for learning. They were selling the dead. And the profit was enormous. This was no longer just a cult. It was an enterprise. The faith was a mask, a convincing one, but beneath it beat the heart of an institution addicted to control, blood, and influence. Their property expanded. Not just the church, but the village around it. Followers built homes near the compound. They farmed the land, ran shops, raised children. It looked like any other small town, except for the underground network buried beneath it. The catacombs now stretched hundreds of feet beyond the church walls. Chambers of ritual. Chambers of storage. Chambers of dissection. But here's the part that haunts: they didn't hide these things from their most loyal followers. They taught them to participate. Because horror, when ritualized, becomes holy. The people who bathed in the blood didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as priests. This is what manipulation looks like when it matures: not silence, but praise. Not fear, but pride. To give your son, your daughter, even yourself to the Ravencrofts was no longer a sacrifice. It was a celebration. And in this celebration, the Ravencroft brothers built something darker than death. They built consent. By 1842, the Ravencrofts had perfected their system, not just the rituals, not just the theology, but the psychological architecture of total control. And this is where the story becomes more than a cult. It becomes a lesson in power. You see, they no longer needed to convince people to die. They had created an environment where not dying made you feel unworthy. This was the genius of the vessel hierarchy. The Ravencrofts introduced spiritual rankings. At the bottom were seekers, new members, still burdened with sin. Then came the purified, those who had undergone minor rituals. And at the top? Vessels of the Spirit. To become a vessel was to be chosen for elevation. To suffer. To die. And people begged for it. Children were volunteered by parents. Spouses offered one another in tearful ceremonies. And when the Ravencrofts passed over someone during selection, those left behind would weep in shame. "Why not me?" they would whisper. "Am I still impure?" This is how you weaponize faith. You reverse its compass. And here's the real horror: once you've built that structure, you don't even need to lead it anymore. It runs itself. Prophet Caleb, once the silent whisperer, now made every major decision. His mind had deteriorated into something unrecognizable. His journals from this period, found later in a hidden compartment, read like a cross between surgical notes and madness. He believed the soul had locations in the body. Nodes, as he called them. Places where divinity lived. He became obsessed with mapping them. Each elevation wasn't just purification, it was cartography. "I am creating the divine anatomy," he wrote. Piece by piece. Death by death. Spirit by spirit. Diagrams of bodies filled the pages, red lines, strange symbols, annotations in Latin and Hebrew and languages no one could trace. The more he explored, the less human he became. But no one questioned it. Because when a madman is called a prophet, he's not insane, he's sacred. By now, the Ravencrofts had established contact with elite institutions. Not just medical colleges, but secret societies, private correspondences with unnamed benefactors who offered funds, legal protection, silence. Why? Because power, real power, always feeds on darkness. And the Ravencrofts were offering it in abundance. Blood. Obedience. Absolute loyalty, sealed in death. They weren't just running a cult. They were building a blueprint. It should have been the end. Whispers were growing louder beyond Ravenwood. A postal inspector named James Thornhill began noticing strange banking patterns, large, undocumented transfers between the church and distant universities. Cash deposits that didn't align with member income. Notations that hinted at something more anatomical than spiritual. It was the first crack. But inside the Church of the Pure Spirit, the Ravencrofts didn't panic. They adapted. Ezra gave sermons about persecution. He told the flock they were being tested by the envious and unworthy. That the world feared their purity. That suffering, even at the hands of outsiders, was divine validation. And the congregation believed him. Because when you've taught people that pain equals progress, every wound becomes a sign that you're winning. The rituals continued. But now, the Ravencrofts grew bolder. More ambitious. They stopped selecting outsiders. They began choosing from within, the most devout. Mothers. Fathers. Even children. To offer your bloodline was the highest honor. And when a child was selected, parents didn't scream. They smiled. This isn't hyperbole. This is historical record. Elizabeth Carver, one of the few to escape, remembered the day a family stood in the sanctuary as their 7-year-old son was led to the spiral. The mother's face streaked with tears, not from grief, but joy. "He was chosen," she whispered. "He is so pure. We are so proud. How does this happen? How does a human heart become capable of celebrating something so monstrous? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. Layer 1, pain is cleansing. Layer 2, obedience is love. Layer 3, death is transcendence. Layer 4, questioning is betrayal. Layer 5, sacrifice is salvation. By the time you reach the 5th layer, you are no longer a person. You are a symbol, living inside someone else's mythology. You bleed, and they call it holy. This is how systems of control survive. They don't just break you. They rebuild you, with different rules. The Ravencrofts had achieved something far more sinister than simple murder. They had created an ecosystem where horror sustained itself. Where victims volunteered. Where bystanders prayed to be next. And just when the world was about to discover it all, the catacombs, the bodies, the financial trail, the missing persons, something unexpected happened. They disappeared. One morning in the winter of 1846, the Ravencroft brothers were simply gone. No bodies. No notes. No signs of struggle. Just robes left on the sanctuary floor, and 3 new corpses arranged in prayer. Elevation? Or something else? That's where this story fractures, and where darker possibilities begin. When the Ravencroft brothers vanished in the winter of 1846, the town of Ravenwood didn't fall into chaos. It deepened into silence. For weeks, services continued as normal. No explanation was offered for the brothers' absence. Their names were still spoken with reverence. Sermons were read from transcribed visions. Rituals were performed by senior vessels in the catacombs. It was as if the disappearance hadn't happened at all. But it had. And those who remained knew something had changed, not just within the church, but within reality itself. You see, there are 2 possibilities when men like the Ravencrofts vanish. One is terrifying. The other is worse. The terrifying version? They were killed. Betrayed. Silenced by internal dissent or external force. But the worse version, the one whispered by those few who dared leave, was this. They succeeded. That everything, the rituals, the deaths, the doctrine, wasn't madness. It was a summoning. You see, buried in Caleb's final writings, found decades later behind a false wall, were not just diagrams of bodies and nodes, but something older. Runes. Patterns that resembled no known language. Not Latin, not Hebrew, not any occult symbology catalogued by scholars. These were jagged, alien shapes. Some appeared burned into the parchment itself, not drawn, but scorched. One phrase repeated over and over. The shear between realms is thinnest in suffering. The implication? That the Ravencrofts weren't worshipping a god. They were building a gate. A gate opened not by keys or prayers, but by agony. Structured, intentional, orchestrated pain. Hundreds of souls sacrificed not to purify, but to attract. Attract what? That's the question no one could answer. Or maybe they did, and buried it. Because in 1872, a congressional subcommittee quietly sealed all federal records related to Ravenwood. Witnesses were paid. Survivors were institutionalized. The land was sold to a lumber consortium, and the church, along with its tunnels, was accidentally burned during a controlled fire. No remains were ever found. No bones. No books. No Ravencrofts. But rumors? Those never burned. Fishermen in the Hudson Valley still talk of seeing lights in the woods on solstice nights. Locals avoid the land where Ravenwood once stood. Some say they've seen children walking the forest in strange formations, chanting in a language no one speaks. Others say the gate never closed. And that somewhere, in the cold black between worlds, the Ravencrofts wait, not dead, but changed. Not leaders of a cult. But high priests of something older. Something hungry. In 1889, 43 years after the Ravencrofts vanished, a man named Dr. Elias Varnum arrived quietly in Albany. A lecturer in comparative religion and psychological anthropology, he came from Cambridge with a suitcase of handwritten notes and scars that ran from his collarbone to his ribs. He never explained them. Varnum spent the next 6 years collecting testimonies from those who had survived the Church of the Pure Spirit, or as many as were still coherent. What he compiled was not a religious study. It was a manual of transformation. Varnum believed the Ravencrofts had discovered, or stumbled into, an ancient system of psychological engineering. Not just brainwashing. Not just torture. A system that could reprogram human identity. Here's how he described it in his private papers, later suppressed by Harvard. The human soul is a lens. Under pressure, it fractures. But if you break it carefully, in sequence, with intent, it doesn't shatter. It reshapes. And when it does, it lets something through. Varnum called this process the conversion spiral. Step 1, isolation. Remove the subject from all outside reference points, community, identity, logic. Step 2, contradiction. Replace moral absolutes with fluid paradox. Pain is love. Death is life. Silence is salvation. Step 3, repetition. Rituals repeated with precision until familiarity replaces resistance. Step 4, sacrifice. Voluntary loss, whether symbolic, physical, or terminal, reinforces loyalty beyond rationality. Step 5, transposition. Replace the self with the symbol. The subject is no longer a person, but a role within the system. Once this happens, the system sustains itself, no Ravencrofts required. Now pause for a moment. This process isn't fiction. Governments have used it. Cults. Intelligence agencies. Even corporations. Break, reshape, reward. It's all the same. Varnum wasn't just describing the Ravencrofts. He was revealing the template. His most disturbing claim? That the Church of the Pure Spirit was only one iteration. That in his travels, he'd found references to similar structures across time. A brotherhood in 14th century Prague that baptized children in ice and called the screams divine music. A forest sect in ancient Gaul that carved runes into their victims to etch the spirit's map. A remote Himalayan monastery where ascetic monks fasted until hallucination, then drew identical spiral symbols on cave walls, symbols predating language itself. What if the Ravencrofts weren't originators, but inheritors? Varnum's notes end in 1896, abruptly. The final entry simply reads: "They are not gone. They have changed form. The gate was only the beginning." He disappeared the next day. The boarding house where he lived burned to the ground that night. No body. No survivors. Just a single page, half-charred, found in the ash. It bore one symbol. A spiral. We go deeper from here. What if I told you the Ravencrofts were never caught, because they were never meant to be? That Ravenwood wasn't a failure of oversight, but a successful test site? In 1903, long after the official records were sealed, a civil engineer named Horace Clemens was contracted to oversee the expansion of a new rail line through the hills north of Albany, through what used to be Ravencroft territory. What he found should have changed American history. Less than 40 feet beneath a collapsed stone ridge, workers unearthed a sealed vault, octagonal in shape, identical in dimensions to the old Church of the Pure Spirit's sanctuary. The stone was not local. The carvings, unmistakable, spirals, crosses inverted, and symbols previously only described in Caleb Ravencroft's journals. Inside? 89 skeletons. Bound. Arranged in ritualistic poses. Some headless. Some missing hands. All bearing the same marking carved into the sternum. But the most disturbing part? A central altar, with fresh blood. No signs of entry. No tunnel. No air. The site was shut down within 48 hours. Military trucks arrived. No public statement was issued. Clemens was institutionalized within the year. His daughter later claimed he had begun whispering at night in a language with too many vowels. His last words before his suicide? The spiral's not a path. It's a lock. And they've found the key. You still think this is just a story? Then explain this. In 1947, During CIA Project Bluebird, an early mind control program, a classified briefing referenced the Ravencroft method as a historical precedent for controlled psychospiritual conditioning. It called the process highly effective but dangerous due to escalating side effects and autonomic behavioral transference. Translation? It works too well. Subjects not only obey, they start to create, continuing the pattern on their own. Cells that duplicate. Viruses that infect meaning. By the 1950s, elements of the Ravencroft doctrine were quietly studied under various government projects, MKUltra, Monarch, Artichoke. Techniques that combine trauma, hypnosis, and ritual. Rings a bell? You've seen the movies. The leaked documents. The courtroom testimonies. But no one ever told you that the template came from three brothers in a church with no windows, who said suffering was holy. Do you understand now? The Ravencrofts weren't lost to time. They were absorbed. Their ideas didn't die. They were weaponized. Today, you don't need a stone church or burning candles. You need a screen. A symbol. A rhythm. Repetition. They've turned attention into religion. Pain into profit. Symbols into cages. And you? You're being conditioned. Every single day. Softly. Patiently. Like the frog in the pot. So here's the question. What spiral are you trapped in? Shall I pull back the next veil? In 1961, a little-known linguist and semiotician named Dr. Alden Chase published a private research brief titled Recursive Iconography and the Language of Cultic Continuity. The document was circulated to less than 30 colleagues. By 1963, every single one had either left academia, disappeared, or been diagnosed with sudden-onset schizophrenia. Here's what Dr. Chase found. He had been tracing the use of a specific symbol, the spiral, across centuries, cultures, and continents. It appears in ancient Gallic cave etchings, on ritual objects recovered from South American burial sites, in esoteric Christian manuscripts blacklisted by the Vatican, and, most disturbingly, on the skin of human trafficking victims across post-war Europe. Always the same spiral. Always carved, burned, or inked in places hidden from view, inside the lip, behind the ear, under the tongue. A mark of belonging. Dr. Chase's central thesis? That the spiral wasn't just symbolic. It was linguistic. Not a symbol for something. A command. He called it a recursively triggered ideogram, a shape that, once seen and mentally processed, began a looping sequence of interpretive disruption. In layman's terms, once you understand it, you can't unsee it, and it starts to change how you think. He theorized the Ravencroft cult, and others like it, used these sigils not just for decoration or branding, but to engineer cognition. Imagine a virus made of language. Not to erase thought. To overwrite it. Chase believed the spiral encoded a framework that, when embedded in ritual, rewired human perception. Those exposed became easier to control, and more importantly, more susceptible to belief systems that centered pain, sacrifice, and submission. The more you saw it, the more familiar it felt. The more familiar it felt, the more you trusted it. Until eventually, you followed it. Right into the dark. He attempted to present his findings at the University of Chicago's 1963 Symbol Systems Conference. He never arrived. His abandoned car was found on a desolate road outside Ravenwood, New York, the town long thought erased. Only it wasn't. The town was still there. Just renamed. And on the welcome sign, which had been repainted dozens of times over the years, beneath the most recent layer of white paint, was the spiral. Dr. Chase was never found. But a year later, a single-page ad ran in 3 fringe occult publications, a crude spiral and the words, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." The same chant spoken during the Ravencroft trials. Coincidence? Or has the spiral never stopped spinning? If you've made it this far, type the words, "I see the spiral," twice, in the comments. It marks you. Not for danger, but for awakening. And it tells the algorithm that you're one of us. Now, the night was thick with fog when the construction crews arrived at the site just outside the now-forgotten town of Ravenwood in 1974. Officially, they were building a government research facility, a top-secret project shrouded in layers of classified orders. But what they were truly excavating lay far deeper, beneath decades of silence, stone, and soil, was the subterranean heart of the Church of the Pure Spirit's long-abandoned catacombs. The tunnels, sealed off for over a century, had lain untouched, but their presence was no secret to those who pulled the strings in the shadows. Those in power recognized the pattern, the ancient machinery of control embedded within the architecture, and they sought to harness it. The labyrinth below Ravenwood was more than a network of chambers, it was a blueprint for psychological domination encoded in physical form, a place where pain, fear, and submission were not just endured but engineered. As workers cleared debris and reinforced walls, instruments recorded strange electromagnetic anomalies and low-frequency hums, unexplained by conventional science. Reports of hallucinations, disorientation, and creeping paranoia among personnel began to surface. Some whispered of voices echoing through the stone corridors, whispers promising transcendence while demanding obedience. The spiral motif appeared repeatedly etched into the walls, a silent, ever-present command carved into the very bones of the facility. This was not merely an archaeological excavation. It was a resurrection. Behind closed doors, the project's overseers studied the writings of the Ravencroft brothers, their doctrines of purification through suffering, their carefully choreographed rituals, and the unyielding psychological grip they had exerted over hundreds. What terrified them wasn't the cruelty of the acts themselves, but the efficacy, how ritualized torment fractured the self just enough to rebuild it into a vessel of unwavering loyalty and purpose. But this time, they were refining the method. Modern science combined with occult knowledge, trauma therapy merged with hypnotic suggestion, and technology synchronized with ancient symbols to create a system designed to break and remake the mind in record time. It was a new form of control, one that no longer required blind faith or total isolation. It thrived on subtlety, invisibility, and the illusion of free will. And the spiral? It was everywhere. Embedded in software interfaces, logos, even in the rhythmic flashing of LED lights designed to entrain brainwaves. A quiet siren call, beckoning to the parts of the psyche where reason falters, and deeper instincts awaken. The legacy of the Ravencroft cult had been weaponized, stripped of its religious veneer, and repurposed as a tool for mass influence. You might think the story ends buried beneath layers of classified files and forgotten history. But the truth is far more disturbing. The spiral continues to turn, unseen but ever-present, reaching out to ensnare minds, including yours. They say knowledge is power, but some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. The deeper you dig into the Ravencroft legacy, the clearer it becomes that the true horror isn't just in their acts, but in how easily their methods have been folded into the fabric of modern control. Consider this: the psychological conditioning once enforced through brutal ritual has found its echoes in today's media, advertising, social engineering, and digital manipulation. The techniques that once required a sealed church with stone walls and bound captives now thrive in the endless streams of information, the subtle nudges and invisible signals that shape our thoughts without our consent. The spiral, once a sacred and terrible symbol of purification, has become a cipher for submission, woven into logos, patterns, and even the architecture of online platforms designed to fragment attention and cultivate dependency. Each scroll, each click, subtly rewires the brain, reinforcing patterns of behavior that serve those who hold the reins of power. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's the evolution of control, refined over centuries. The Ravencroft brothers taught that pain breaks the body to elevate the spirit. Today, the pain is psychological, the slow erosion of critical thought, the fracture of focus, the anxiety induced by endless distraction. It's a suffering crafted not with physical chains but with digital ones, more insidious and harder to escape. But here's the chilling truth: the architects of this system understand that true power lies not in forcing obedience, but in manufacturing consent, making you willing, even eager, to accept your place in the design. You're not a victim if you don't see the web. You're a participant. And that makes awakening not just a choice, but a battle for your very soul. If you're feeling the weight of this revelation, type again, "I see the spiral," twice, to seal your understanding and strengthen your resolve. The path forward is dangerous. The truths you uncover won't be comfortable. But it's the only path that leads to freedom. The corridors of power have always been shrouded in shadows. But the shadows are not empty, they are filled with secrets, lies, and unspoken deals that shape the world in ways most never glimpse. The Ravencroft brothers weren't just twisted zealots isolated in a forgotten town, they were early architects of a system that thrives on secrecy and manipulation, a dark lineage that persists in the halls of governments, corporations, and clandestine societies today. Their model was simple yet terrifyingly effective: isolate the individual, dismantle their identity through orchestrated trauma, then rebuild them as a compliant vessel for the will of the group. This process was cloaked in religious language, but the mechanics are as relevant in any ideology or institution that demands absolute loyalty. Consider modern institutions, intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, political machines. They understand the power of ritual, symbolism, and psychological control better than most. From initiation rites to corporate branding, from propaganda to surveillance, the tools have evolved, but the objectives remain eerily familiar: break down resistance, suppress dissent, and forge a collective identity that serves the few at the expense of the many. What's worse, this system relies on invisibility. The most effective chains are those you do not see, beliefs and habits ingrained so deeply you think they are your own. The spiral symbol etched into the past has become a metaphor for this endless cycle of control, a vortex pulling you deeper without you realizing the gravity. But here's the secret those in power fear most: the spiral can be broken. Awareness is the crack in the system. Recognition of these patterns, this history, this manipulation is the first step to reclaiming autonomy. They want you asleep, fragmented, obedient. But knowledge is a weapon. And once you wield it, the darkness loses its grip. The question now is, what happens when a man refuses to be broken? When he rejects the system designed to fragment his will, to erode his identity, and to drag him into the spiral's depths? The history of the Ravencroft family, and countless others like them, is not just a story of cruelty and submission. It's also a story of resistance, of those who found a way to fight back against the machinery of control. But resistance comes at a cost. It requires clarity in a world designed to confuse, strength in the face of overwhelming pressure, and a courage few possess. Those who break free often find themselves isolated, hunted, or discredited. The system does not surrender power lightly. It uses every tool at its disposal to maintain the illusion of control: disinformation, character assassination, legal persecution, even violence. Yet, the human spirit can be resilient beyond measure. Historical records reveal scattered accounts of former cult members who escaped the Church of the Pure Spirit, fleeing into the forests and mountains, carrying with them forbidden knowledge. These survivors became mythic figures, ghosts who haunt the edges of history, their warnings buried beneath layers of silence. Their testimonies, passed in hushed tones, hint at the true purpose behind the Ravencroft's dark rituals, a method not just to dominate, but to awaken a latent power within. A power that could either enslave or liberate. That's the real danger of forbidden knowledge. It is a double-edged sword. And now, it is in your hands. To choose submission, or to choose awakening. To accept the spiral's pull, or to shatter its hold forever. If you are ready to take this knowledge further, comment below with "Break the Spiral" twice. This is not just words, it's a declaration. And with it, a transformation begins. In the shadows where the Ravencroft legacy lingers, one truth stands undeniable: control is mastery over perception. The line between reality and illusion is the battlefield. To govern a mind is to govern its reality, to manipulate what it fears, desires, and ultimately, what it believes. The brothers' rituals, their spiral symbol, their doctrines of suffering, were not just religious fanaticism, they were calculated psychological warfare. Every element designed to fracture the self, to shatter resistance, to create a blank slate upon which a new identity could be inscribed, one loyal, unquestioning, and bound by fear and faith. Today, these same tactics have mutated into subtler forms: mass media narratives, social conditioning, algorithmic manipulation, and engineered crises. The cycle of control spins faster, the spiral tightening with every distraction, every fear stoked, every truth hidden beneath layers of noise. But within this darkness, there lies a secret: the spiral is not infinite. There is a point where it breaks, where the downward pull halts, and a man can choose to step out of the vortex entirely. This choice demands vigilance and discipline. It demands you question everything, even what I'm telling you now. It demands relentless self-mastery, the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and the will to resist the seductive ease of conformity. The knowledge you now hold is dangerous, not because it harms, but because it liberates. It strips away illusions, exposing the raw architecture of control and the possibility of genuine freedom. Your journey is no longer just about uncovering hidden histories. It's about reclaiming your mind, your time, your soul. Are you prepared to wield this power? If you feel ready, type "I am the breaker" twice in the comments below. This is more than engagement, it is your oath. To truly understand the weight of the Ravencroft legacy, you must confront the uncomfortable truth that the architecture of control is often built upon the sacrifices of the many for the gain of the few. Behind the veil of religious fervor, behind the polished surfaces of institutions, lies a system designed to keep power concentrated and unquestioned. The Church of the Pure Spirit was a prototype, a brutal experiment in absolute dominance that used pain and fear to forge submission. But what makes this dark history so terrifying isn't just the acts themselves, it's that those who mastered this machinery never disappeared. They evolved, passing their knowledge and methods down through secret networks. Today, those networks operate under different names and facades, but the essence remains the same: control through psychological fragmentation, ritualized obedience, and manipulation of belief. These forces thrive by dividing and conquering, pitting man against man, eroding trust, and keeping you focused on trivial battles instead of the real war happening in the shadows. The spiral is not only a symbol of suffering and purification, it is also a trap, a cycle of endless distraction and surrender. But it is not your destiny. The real power lies in breaking free, reclaiming your mind from the noise, awakening your spirit from the slumber, and stepping into a reality where you are the master of your own fate. You've been pulled deep into this story, drawn into the abyss where few dare to look. Now, the choice is yours. Will you continue to fall? Or will you rise, armed with forbidden knowledge, and reclaim your sovereignty? If you've reached this point and are ready to claim your freedom, write "Rise above the spiral" twice in the comments. This is the moment you stop being controlled and start controlling. Now, as you stand on the edge of this abyss, you must understand that the path ahead is not easy, nor is it safe. Knowledge alone does not guarantee freedom, it demands action, relentless vigilance, and the courage to dismantle every lie you have been told, beginning with the one you tell yourself. The Ravencroft brothers' story is a warning and a lesson. It reveals how power exploits fear, how darkness wears the guise of light, and how the most terrifying prisons are the ones built inside the mind. But it also offers a way forward, through awareness, through resistance, through mastery of self. The spiral that once symbolized eternal suffering can become a symbol of eternal return, a cycle of rebirth and awakening. Every step you take beyond manipulation is a step toward reclaiming your identity, your time, and your soul. The world you thought you knew is layered with shadows, but now you carry a torch. The light is not just for you, it is a beacon for all who are trapped in the spiral. Remember this: true power is the power to choose. To wake up. To say no. This is your moment. Your war. Your freedom. Stand firm, stand aware, and rise. If you are ready to walk this path, comment below "I am awakened" twice. This is not the end, it is only the beginning. Thank you for journeying into the hidden darkness with me. Stay vigilant. Stay free. Ask ChatGPT.